Welcome to Digital Hammurabi, your guide to the ancient world, and a podcast devoted to sharing reliable, fact-based scholarship without the jargon of academia. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. I'm passionate about ancient history, and with 2 graduate degrees in the field, I am intimately familiar with the world of academic research. I'm here to help you avoid ancient aliens and, with nearly a decade of podcasting experience, help academic researchers explain their work in an entertaining and engaging way. What parts of the Hebrew Bible can reliably be used to reconstruct history is a topic of ongoing discussion among scholars and non-academics alike. Today, Dr. Jacob Wright joins me to talk about how he peels back the layers of the biblical text to better understand who wrote what and why. Dr. Jacob L. Wright received his doctorate in theology from the University of Göttingen in 2003 and currently serves as Professor of Hebrew Bible at Candler School of Theology and as an associate faculty member at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He has published extensively on war and warfare in the ancient Near East and Hebrew Bible, and his most recent book, Why the Bible Began, An Alternative History of Scripture and Its Origins, has won multiple awards, including the 2024 Prose Award, and was included in the New Yorker's Best Books We Read in 2023. Dr. Wright is also going to be teaching an 8-part lecture series, which will be turned into an online course, on the topic of the rise and fall of biblical Israel, the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Well, Dr. Jacob Wright, hello, it's so nice to meet you. Thank you for joining us on Digital Hammurabi.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Now, before we get started properly, I wanted to ask how you got into the academic study of the Hebrew Bible.
Well, I started out as a kid really interested in philosophy, history, and all of that, but I thought I would go on to become a physicist or doctor, and started off college in that direction, but soon switched gears and started Jewish studies, started doing ancient Near Eastern studies. I was at the University of Kansas City, Missouri, but there were some professors there that were really outstanding, taught me Akkadian and all kinds of stuff, and I got one-on-one attention from them. And then I went off to Germany right after that, and not with the intention of pursuing a PhD, but stayed there and spent about 12 years studying Assyriology, Egyptology, but also Hebrew Bible is where I did my dissertation.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, a lot of your previous publications have been on war and warfare around the ancient Near East, the Hebrew Bible. Why does this appeal to you as an area of research?
Yeah, it's people tend to think that I'm interested in like military formation, which I am kind of, or battles and warfare. But what I'm really interested in is human society and kind of how humans think about themselves and how they come together in times of crisis. And so there are many different forms of crisis. One would be like an epidemic. But what make them very distinctive is that they target not a general geographic area, but political communities. And so once you really get into wars, you get also into how people relate to outsiders. Like, were they for us? Did they help us? Or were they against us? I'm in the South, during the Civil War and after, Jews were, blamed for a lot of things. So are they really outsiders or are they really Southerners? And that goes on and on throughout history for Jews, let's say after World War I, where they tried to say, hey, we fought on Germany's side, therefore you can't send us off into the camps. Nevertheless, they did. It did help, though. That's the kind of larger issue of how peoples come together, how communities relate to each other, and then also various things such as material culture and the technology. It's really just a wonderful way to bring things together and to make it also exciting for people. I'll say this. I did my dissertation on a very technical topic, a memoir called Nehemiah's Memoir from the Book of Ezra Nehemiah. And after I wrote it, I was going to do my second book, and I wanted to do something that people would read. And I asked some friends, and they said, war might be a good topic. It was during the Iraq War. I said, let's do war. And that's kind of took me off in that direction.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, the course you're going to be teaching in March looks at Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings as kind of a lens for understanding the rise and fall of biblical Israel. What do we know about who actually wrote these books?
Nothing.
Fantastic.
We know nothing, and we need to be very honest about that. Now, we can learn about them from what they write, and we can learn about them from the various, what I'm very interested in, the kind of what we call diachronic layers in a text, so that this text would have had to be written, let's say, after the downfall of the Northern Kingdom. So we can kind of get to various groups and their agendas, but in terms of where they're actually located, who paid them, what their livelihood was if they weren't being paid by the palace, how they collaborated, those are fascinating questions that we don't have answers for, but it allows us to speculate around things and to do some comparative work. So like in your work on the ancient Near East, of how scribes work and how to kind of trace different schools and different families and so forth. We really can't do that on the Bible, but we can do the comparative kind of analogy kind of approach.
Thank you. Now, we obviously, as you said, don't know kind of what walks of life these people were in. How far can we get in terms of when they were written? Can we get any kind of accuracy or detail with that?
Yeah, that's a bit easier, I think. Still very debatable, and it really divides the field. You have conservatives who are trying to claim still that a lot of these texts go way back into the earliest days of the kingdom of Israel, or David and King Solomon. All these texts were from the golden period of power and might. Or let's say with Joshua, a leading thesis says that Joshua is actually Josiah, the King Josiah, and it's not that he actually historically was, but that they're using that name, and so it comes from the Josianic period, which was kind of a strong period in Judah's history. And what I'm trying to do is show maybe some texts go back, but let's look at how the texts have been read and reread. So I really am not interested in the earliest. I'm more interested in kind of, I can't get to that bottom foundation, but I can start peeling off layers. And those layers are what's really interesting for me, how whatever is here at the bottom, what's accumulated on top of it over the years to create the kind of text that we know today.
That's a fantastic lead into my next question. I was going to ask, are these texts based on earlier sources, or do they appear to have been composed kind of whole cloth, as it were?
Good question. Yeah. So earlier sources, yes. In many ways, there are earlier sources, but that doesn't mean that the source itself is some kind of a historical firsthand account or drawn from archives. It's, in some cases, they may be. Some of these lists in Joshua or some of the kinds of accounts of David might have been memorialized in some way in a graphic form that could then be rewritten and reinscribed and what have you. But for me, the question of older sources is that very same thing, that there's layer upon layer and layer, and the question of what is a source is really from what is your perspective. It's the source for a later generation working in earlier earlier text, then that would be the older source. But even that, it's always kind of an infinite regress, and at the end it kind of dwindles like sand through our fingers.
Now, there's a very human, or at least modern human tendency, I think, to read these books as history, because they look a lot like what a modern audience expects from a history book. How were they intended to be used? Maybe not by the original authors, because that's quite difficult to get at, but or maybe not intended. How were they used through their history within the culture that created them?
That's a big question, and in every age, they're perhaps being used in different ways. So today, how the book of Joshua is used, let's say in current Israeli politics, is probably very different than it was used, let's say, by the rabbis throughout the Middle Ages, and how it's used by Christians in seeing Joshua as a foretype of Jesus. So one would have to look what we call reception history, how the text has been received or read, And that is really relies on the experts of those periods. Let's say if you're going to do the reception history of Joshua in the Middle Ages, you should be a medieval scholar. But to go back to our time, more back to the Iron Age and what have you, I think these texts were being brought together for the purpose of nothing other than an attempt by creative writers, what we call scribes, to reimagine their past. And they're actually being read and written for each other. There is no reading public at this time. We shouldn't imagine these texts being read at the synagogue or read in public or being taught to their children, as the text call their readers to do. Teach these things to your children, like the monuments in Joshua. When you see these stones, your children will ask, what do they mean? This is what you tell them. But that's all aspirational on the part of these scribes who are imagining a readership, a reading public before it existed. And they're really writing for each other. And that's what makes it really amazing, I think, that they put so much time and energy in creating really quite impressive text without any readership beyond their own circles. That means that they were really engaged with each other and learning from each other. It's like musicians. I often think of it like jazz musicians down in the basement making beautiful art, but no one's listening to it aside from themselves. And what then it makes it all the more interesting is that that stuff is so good, it starts to be published, enjoyed, and read like an album would be in jazz music. And it has an afterlife that was never imagined by its authors.
That's a really fantastic way of describing it. Thank you. If these texts then were initially imagined as like a reimagining of a nation's history, how do they map onto what we know of historical events? So what parts, if any, of the biblical Israel's rise and fall seem to be historically viable?
That's where I really love to go, where to kind of dwell on, because it's the divergence of what we know historically, archaeologically, from external sources, but also from the archaeological record, that divergence from history and memory that helps us to appreciate what the memory is doing, that is, what the biblical text is doing. So some would say, well, going back even today, but going back, let's say 30 years ago, they were reading the book of Joshua as an attempt to, with the eye, like what they say, the Bible in one hand and the spade in the other. They were digging up the land, believing that Joshua was pretty much a good guide on the details, might be inflated, but a good guide of how Israel emerged in the land. And that approach mixes history and literature in a way that's not helpful. You know, when we're teaching our students, we want to say, forget about the history of that how this text relates to history, approach the text on its own terms, and then later ask, well, when did this text emerge? That's going to help us get at history. But then also appreciate that the archaeological record shows that no, there's no unified conquest as depicted in Joshua. And thus, why did the biblical authors depict a unified conquest? And that brings that question to the fore for the students. We can't get to that really most important question without having that historical critique, that model, that exercise of methodology that kind of creates a tabula rasa so that we can start appreciating this literature as literature. And once again, there are things that coincide with the archaeological record, but we have to be very careful. Instead of starting there, we can find it as we go along.
Thank you very much. So if we don't have things like the unified monarchy, can we look at any of maybe the characters or the figures in these books and say, oh, well, this may have been inspired by an historical figure, or should we treat them primarily as literary characters who are there to fulfill a role within a narrative?
Mm-hmm. Like, once again, one begins with the idea that David is a historical figure, and he probably was. But then one reads the text as, well, let's just be a little bit skeptical about how these authors are portraying things, but nevertheless, there must be some kind of truth behind the text, and they're dealing with facts. And one can kind of be a leading book by Joel Baden on David it follows this approach of saying the lady doth protest too much, meaning the text is trying to show that David is so above reproach in these matters that he must have actually been doing these things. So one uses the account in the book of Samuel to actually get at the historical King David. And what one misses in that approach, I wrote a book on King David that takes the opposite approach, and that is we have to see that nobody during the time of King David would be writing these things about King David. There are so many negative parts. It can't come from the Davidic dynasty. And no, even Josiah, centuries after, would not talk about the founder of the dynasty in a way like this. So yes, we can do historical David kinds of stuff. And we can kind of look in the text, and which I'm trying to do, and see that David was a warlord, local. He wasn't an Israelite. He didn't see himself as a member of the people of Israel. That's a later overlay. It's very much a Judean focused text, very much around Hebron, not Jerusalem. All of those things help us get at earlier memories of David. But once again, we don't begin with the assumption that David is a historical figure, and we're going to sift through these texts to find out historical memories about him, because then we're running roughshod over the literature and not appreciating it as literature. We have to see this as a text and a story, and then once we start looking into it, we can ask once again, well, who wrote this and why?
Thank you. I have one final question before we finish up. As an academic, how do you take a text like any of these and start to peel back the layers and work out which piece was added when and why, and what it's doing and how it plays on what is there already?
That's my cup of tea. That's what I love to do. It's called diachronic analysis. Synchronic is just to read the text as it is, as a piece of literature. To say, well, how was King David, how the stories were interpreted by Rembrandt. Diachronic says which parts are earlier and which parts are later. So the question that you're asking, which is, I love it, how do we do that? And the way we do that is to pay attention to breaks in the text, contradictions, or the lady that protests kind of too much in a sense of like trying to, where a later text is trying to reinterpret a text and really emphasize the opposite, where the language diverges. Can we pull out one chapter and then see a join, like in the cuneiform tablets, where if you can find two tablets from two different libraries and they come together, then you got a join, right? So we have 3 chapters, pull one chapter out, and we got a nice join. Boy, beautifully read together. And then we can explain, well, what does this chapter do that intrudes upon it? So if we can explain that there's a good reason why this middle chapter would have been inserted between these two, and that middle chapter has different language, and it contradicts in many ways, or takes it in a new direction, or does something more elaborate, then we have enough reasons to postulate that there was an older text that has been amplified. Once again, we rarely find any confirmation of this, but we have found some within Qumran. For example, the book of Judges, people had always thought, Judges 6, there's a little passage there about a prophet, that was inserted at a later point. Lo and behold, they find the Qumran scrolls, and precisely that passage is missing. So that's rare that we find that. And the Qumran scrolls, of course, all the way in the 2nd century. So there were scrolls being transmitted that didn't have that passage. And here's the point. Many of the skeptics of our approach, of our historic critical approach, would have said they're just like playing with their ideas. It's like a beautiful mind kind of thing. That doesn't really, we can't follow them. And then people say, no, there's something to that. And no. And then we find the Qumran scrolls and okay, there's something to it. So it really helps us to kind of affirm that there is something to this. It can get out of hand, no doubt, but diachronic studies is the most exciting stuff because you get to see how readers read text.
Lovely. Thank you very, very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
It's a pleasure talking to you too.
Audience, if you found this interesting, then you can find details of Dr. Wright's course, The Rise and Fall of Biblical Israel, by following the link in the video description. It is an affiliate link, so if you choose to sign up, then I will receive a small percentage of the course fee, which will go towards running the channel. Early bird pricing is only $49.95 and will run until February 16th, after which the price will go up to $59.95. The live recordings will be taking place on March 1st and 15th, but it will be available as an online course if you can't make those dates.